Good day, everyone. Welcome to another module reading for the social psychology. And our topic today is about persuasion. As a consumer, we often do not think carefully about the purchases we make. Research suggests that about half of the purchases in a supermarket are impulse buys, and that 62% of all shoppers in discount store buy at least one item on an unplanned basis. This module will introduce the two routes to persuasion. The process of how people can be persuaded. Objectives number one describe how the factors that compose persuasion affect that the likelihood that we will take either the central or the peripheral route to perception. Number two is identify some tactics for resisting influence. How might we prepare people to resist unwanted persuasion? Number three is identify two paths leading to influence. Describe the type of cognitive processing each involves and its effect. Persuasion. Persuasion is a process by which a message is delivered by a communicator, which aims to induce change to one's belief, attitude, or behaviors. Generally, persuasion can be seen in media such as advertisement, political purposes, and societal news. Some efforts to persuade could be diabolical, controversial, and sometimes beneficial. It delivers a message wherein its purpose and contents influence one's judgment. It could be bad propaganda or good education. Educative persuasion is a more factual but less coercive than propaganda. It is also inevitable whether it be educative or for propaganda. Paths of, paths of persuasion. Study shows that if a persuasive message is clear but unconvincing, one can easily question the message, and persuasion is more likely to occur. If the message gave convincing arguments, it will become more favorable and more likely to be persuaded. Number one, the central route. This is the number one path, persuasion. Number one, central route. A persuasion occurs in the central route if a person focuses more on arguments. If the arguments are reasonable and irresistible, people are more likely to persuaded. But if the message seems to be weak, then it will be easily to encounter out. It's easy to counter argue and question the message. Thus, persuasion is less likely to occur. This route, when people have the time to think carefully and rely not only on the strength and delivering the message, but also on their thoughts. If a message was given time to be critical, it is more likely to persuade, avoid attacks, or influence behavior. The number two path of the persuasion is the peripheral route. There are also times that people cannot think carefully as if they were distracted, uninvolved, or busy, and won't be able to focus more on the message delivered. If this is the case, then people tend to focus on incidental cues that lead us to automatic acceptance without much thinking. Some example of the incidental cues are physical appearance, delivery of a speech, reputation, etc. A peripheral route often provides an elusive and temporary attitude change. An individual in a peripheral route doesn't have the time to analyze issues, and it only relies on the trust the expert and long message are credible. So that's the two path to persuasion. Next is element of persuasion. Number one, the communicator who says. Social psychologists found that person who delivered the message does affect how the audience receive this message. There's under this the credibility. If the communicator is said to be credible, he is trustworthy and expert in what he is saying. An expert person delivers his message that the audience agrees with and make them seem smart. This person also appears credible if he speaks confidently and straightforward. A trustworthy person makes the audience believe that he is not trying to persuade them. He is also perceived as sincere, especially if he argues against his self-interest. Moreover, a communicator is said to be credible if he talks fast, as they are found as more objective, intelligent, and knowledgeable than slow speakers. If a credible communicator's message is said to be persuasive, the message influence may fade and be forgotten or dissociate from the message. On the other hand, he could be more influential in delivering the message only if the message is better than a reason for discounting it. This is called sleeper effect, wherein a message delayed impact occurs when a message is effective. The audience forget the reason for discounting it. Next is attractiveness and liking. Another effective communicator also depends on his attractiveness, and communicator also depends on his attractiveness, period. A communicator should be or should have qualities that appeals to the audience, as this is more likely to be persuasive. The audience liking may depend on the communicator's arguments or the central route persuasion, or the communicator's appearance or the product's peripheral route perception. Next is under the attractiveness and liking is physical attractiveness. Emotional arguments are more likely to be influential when the communicator is beautiful. Chaiken, 1979, Bion and Stein, 1978, and Palak and others, 1983. Next is similarity. Communicator is more likely to be influential if they have similarity to the audience, especially on how they act and how they think. Next, the message content. What is said or what is said? The first one is who said. This one is the message content is what is said or who says. Next. Another element of persuasion that needs to be considered is best message content that promotes central route persuasion. Reason versus emotion. This is under message content, reason versus emotion. The message content should be delivered to the audience, whether it is more reasonable or emotional. If the audience is well educated or analytical, they are more responsive to rational and logical demand. But if the audience attitude has been affected, especially their emotion before the delivery of the message, they are more responsive in an emotional argument. Next, under the message content is the effective of good feelings. Studies found that the positive feelings before the delivery of a message yield persuasion. Positive feelings enhance positive thinking and lead to a positive approach to the message. The advantage of good feeling is that it elicits impulsivity and rely more on peripheral cues. If a person is not in the mood, then they are less likely to be affected by weak arguments. Next, the effect of arousing fear. This is still under the message content. The effect of arousing fear. Eliciting negative emotion could also persuade the audience, especially if you are promoting to avoid destructive products such as cigarette. This is why cigarette packs always have a graphic presentation of smoking hazard to show smokers how dangerous smoking is. O'Hagarty and others 2007, Peters and others 2007, Stark and others 2008. On the other hand, eliciting fear doesn't always make the message to become persuasive. There are a lot of smokers who continue smoking. Some people are afraid of AIDS but still not doing abstinence or using condoms. When fear refers to pleasurable and satisfying, it will lead to deny rather than behavioral change. Elliot, Aronson, 1977. Thus, the fear-arousing message would become effective if it pertains to the severity of the fear of the threatening effect of the message and if the message gives solution and makes them feel capable of implementing it. By Devils-Comby and Salovey, 2002, Maddox-Rogers, 1983, Reuter and others, 2001. Still under the message content is discrepancy. Whether it is small or large, the effect of a discrepancy depends on the credibility of the communicator. The communicator would inoculate an effective behavior change if we were delivering a message that is greatly discrepant from the recipients. A moderate discrepant message tends to be profound, especially if it contradicts the view of the audience. By Palak and others, 1972, Petty and Casiopo, 1979, Ryan and Severance, 1970. Another one is one-sided versus two-sided appeals, still in the message content. Under the message content, one-sided versus two-sided appeals. There are common issues that persuaders are facing. It is dealing with opposing arguments. If the communicator acknowledged the opposing side, the audience would be confused and the message would be weakened. But it is also fairer if message recognizes the opposing arguments. The message, the one-sided appeal, is effective if the audience agreed with the communicator. But if the audience opposes the message, a two-sided appeal works better for them. Thus, a two-sided appeal is more likely to be effective if the audience is aware of the opposing arguments. For example, the communicator would appeal, throw your waist on the ground floor. And the people would oppose it because it is time-consuming and tiring if they came from fifth floor. Yeah, it's tiring when they came from fifth floor. The communicator would then have to follow up and appeal. It may be convenient, but it is important. Next is primacy versus recency. This is still under the message content. Primacy refers to the communicator who assigned to speak first, and recency refers to the communicator who recently spoke or who will speak last. The effectiveness of these two depends on the time gap between the first communicator and the second communicator. If the first message is quickly followed by the second message and the time gap given to the audience before they have respond, the first message is more likely to be effective, the primacy effect. On the other hand, if the first message is followed by the second message after a long period, the second message is more likely to be effective. This is because in primacy effect, if all things are equal, first impressions are important. If time gaps would mediate between the two messages, there is a possibility that the first message can forget. That's why recency effect take place. Number three, the channel of communication. Who is it said? So, again. Number three is channel of communication. How is it said? First one, who says. Second one is what it said. Number three, the third one is the channel of communication. How is it said? A channel of communication is a way of how the message is delivered. It could be through writing, face-to-face interaction, media, etc. Under this, number three is the channel of communication. How it said is the active experience in and or passive reception. Active experience or passive reception. Studies show that spoken words are usually less likely to be persuasive. This is why communicators should learn to deliver a message that gets the audience's attention and is clear, convincing, memorable, and compelling. On the other hand, passively received message, like for example the media, is sometimes effective and sometimes not. However, persuasion decreases if the importance and familiarity of the issue increase. Hence, media is very powerful in persuading the audience as this can give familiarity to the product or the message. Thus, the audience is more likely to be persuaded. Second is the personal versus media influence. Personal versus media influence. Persuasion studies reveal that personal contact with people is more likely to be effective than the media. The power of personal word-of-mouth influence is very effective through viral marketing. This proves that the product became the best-selling product not because of the media advertisement, but because people were talking about it to other people that give them an interest in the said product. Media influence the two-step flow. Although personal influence is more effective than media, although personal influence is more effective than media influence, we should not forget that without the media, there will be no source of their message. The two-step flow on communication is from the media to the opinion leaders, the rank and the file. The media serves to be the source of the messages or the message, while the opinion leaders serve to be influential or the experts. Dapat to nire-revise na. These were the people in the talk shows, the doctors or the teachers who deliver a message from the media that persuaded the audience or the rank and file. Next is comparing media. Media channels can be through television programs, social media, newspaper, or etc. Research reveals that the more lifelike media, the more persuasive its message. The more persuasive its message. Therefore, live or the face-to-face is more likely to be persuasive than videotape, which is more likely to be persuasive than audio tape, which is more likely to be persuasive than written. So the face-to-face is very mas nakatulog na ako. Mas effective ang face-to-face than the videotape or audio tape or yung nababasa lang natin. Next is, number 4, the audience to whom it said. So, ang ating number 1 is ang communicator. Ang ating communicator is the who says. Number 2 is the message content, what it said. What is said by the communicator. Next, the channel of communication, how it's said. Pwedeng sa media yan, social media, or sa tabloid, or sa broadsheet, or sa radio. Maybe sa YouTube. Social media, ano. Next, the audience to whom it says, kanino ito sinabi. The audience traits and characteristic might not predict their influence on social pressure, but is a significant factor that can be considered if one is to be persuaded. Number 1 is the age. There are explanations for age differences in terms of attitude. The first one is the life cycle explanation, wherein attitude change as people grow older. And the generational explanation, wherein people do not change. Yet they stick with the attitude adopted when they were young. According to research, like support with the generational explanation, the attitude of the older generation is less likely to change than younger generations. Adolescence to early adulthood are the stages where attitudes are formed and changeable and become stabilized in middle adulthood, like Koenig and others, 2008, Krosnick and Alway, 1989. Yun ay sinabi nila. However, older adults aren't inflexible. They may become more susceptible to attitude change because as they grow much older, their attitude weakens. Next is their thoughts. What are they thinking? In the central route, persuasion did not focus much on the message, but it focuses more on its responses in an audience's mind. If the message is favorable to the audience, then they are more likely to be persuaded. If the message contradicts the audience arguments, then they are less likely to be persuaded. Under this, their thought is forewarned is formed. If you care enough to the counter-argue, one factor of counter-argument is being aware that someone is going to persuade you. If someone forewarned you about the argument, you are more likely to anticipate how the arguments would flow and prepare or forearm yourself to counter-argue. Next is distraction disarms counter-arguing. Another technique used in persuading people is to apply distraction. This is usually done in advertisement, wherein they construct a message that promotes the product and visual image that keep the audience distracted or occupied. It makes the audience focus on the distractor to prevent them from analyzing the words. Next is uninvolved audience use peripheral cues. Central route persuasion promotes analytical thinking and focuses more on the arguments. Peripheral route persuasion focuses on heuristic cues, and people are quicker to respond to the communicator's attractiveness. The uninvolved audience use peripheral cues because they like to conserve their mental resources and they have a low need for cognition. One way to persuade the audience is to consider how they think and how they would likely react. The communicator should make the audience think actively through asking rhetorical questions. Like for example, alien ba? Naintindihan ba? Presenting multiple speakers, I'm sorry. Presenting multiple speakers, challenge them with with critical problems, etc. In this way, the communicator would take the audience to process the message in central route to persuasion. Thus, stimulating think strengthens the message and become more persuasive. How can persuasion be resisted? Pagka ayaw mo, huwag ka makipag-usap. Talikuran mo. Again, that is me. How can persuasion be resisted? Strengthening personal commitment. If people rely only on their appeals in an argument, they will become less susceptible or open to other notion that needs to be considered in an argument. However, before dealing with the other's opinion, one must be committed to their stance. Like, for example, it's a challenging belief. To motivate a person to commit themselves, attack their beliefs strongly enough for them to counter-argue and be committed to their appeals. Next is developing counter-arguments. This is attitude inoculation. Attitude inoculation is one of the many ways to develop counter-arguments to the audience. It is introducing weak attacks to one's position so that they would be immune to small challenges. So when stronger attacks come, they could forearm counter-arguments and resist powerful attacks. Next, implication of attitude inoculation. To resist brainwashing by social pressure, one must not only indoctrinate their counter-belief, but also they have to prepare to have counter-persuasive appeals. Also, if one views was challenged, they are more likely to be committed to the position that to undermine it by Visser or Mirabile 2004. And lastly, an ineffective appeal can be worse than none. An ineffective appeal may result in the inoculation of the audience against further appeals. For example, in an experiment, students were assigned to write essay about strict dress code, but because all students were against the idea of a strict dress code, they chose not to write an essay. And they even strengthened the appeals regarding anti-dress codes by Darley and Cooper, 1972. This concludes that one way to strengthen one's attitude is to challenge them. So we have here the glossary. Number 1 is persuasion. The persuasion is the process by which a message induces a change in belief, attitudes, or behavior. Number 2 is the central route to persuasion. Occurs when interested people focus on the arguments and respond with the favorable thoughts. Number 3 is the peripheral route to persuasion. Occurs when people are influenced by incidental cues such as speaker attractiveness. Number 4 is credibility. This is the believability. A credible communicator is perceived as both expert and trustworthy. Now, next is sleeper effect. A delayed impact of a message that occurs when an initially discounted message becomes effective as we remember the message but forget the reason for discounting it. Number 6 is primacy effect. Other things being equal, the information presented first usually the most influence. Number 7 is recency effect. Information presented last sometimes has the most influence. Recency effect are less common than primacy effect. Number 8 is need for cognition. The motivation to think and analyze, assessed by agreement with items such as the notion of thinking abstractly is appealing to me, and disagreement with items such as I only think I only think as hard as I have to. Minsan sinasabi ko to sa sarili ko, actually. So we have these references, Mayor's G 2012, Social Psychology 11th edition by McGraw-Hill Higher Education. Next is Mayor's G 2014, Exploring Social Psychology 7th edition McGraw-Hill Higher Education. Until dito na lang po ang ating pagbasa sa module ng Social Psychology, and ang ating topic ay Persuasion. Magandang gabi po at salamat!